August 22, 2023. A property manager in Gary, Indiana knocked on the door of a rental apartment for what she thought would be a routine inspection. What she discovered inside would shock investigators, horrify a community, and expose one of the most heartbreaking cases of child abandonment in recent memory. 3 children, ages 11, 14, and 16, had been living completely alone for nearly 3 years while their mother, Keisha Williams, moved in with various boyfriends across the Midwest. When authorities entered that apartment, they found garbage piled 4 feet high throughout every room. Human waste covered the floors. The 2 younger children hadn't stepped outside in over 2 years. They were sleeping on pizza boxes because there were no beds. The 16-year-old girl had become the sole caregiver, rationing food deliveries and protecting her siblings from a world that had forgotten they existed. Welcome back to our channel, where we uncover the most shocking true crime cases that reveal the darkest corners of human behavior. If stories like this remind you why it's crucial to pay attention to the vulnerable people in our communities, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Today's case will challenge everything you think you know about maternal instinct and family bonds. This isn't just another abandonment case. This is the story of children who survived the unthinkable, a mother who chose her relationships over her own flesh and blood, and a community that rallied together when the truth finally came to light. But before we dive into how these children endured years of neglect, let me ask you this. How long do you think 3 children could survive completely on their own before someone noticed they were missing? Gary, Indiana had seen better days, but the community on the south side where the Williams family lived still maintained a sense of neighborhood watch. Families knew each other, children played together in the small courtyard between apartment buildings, and residents looked out for one another during tough times. Or so everyone thought. The second-floor apartment at the center of our story sat in a complex where single mothers often raised children on their own, and neighbors understood the struggles of making ends meet. Keisha Williams appeared to be just another young mother working multiple jobs to support her 3 children. Neighbors occasionally saw the kids, though not regularly. The family kept to themselves, which wasn't unusual in a community where many people dealt with their own challenges. No one suspected that behind the locked door of that modest 2-bedroom apartment, 3 children were fighting for survival every single day. The children at the heart of this story weren't typical victims. The oldest, a 16-year-old girl whose name we're protecting due to the ongoing legal proceedings, had essentially become a mother to her 11 and 14-year-old brothers. These weren't helpless children waiting for rescue. They were survivors who had created their own system for staying alive when the one person who should have protected them simply vanished. The teenage girl had learned to manage the household in ways no teenager should ever have to master. She figured out how to order food delivery using EBT cards and cash their mother occasionally sent through mobile payment apps. She protected her brothers from the outside world, understanding instinctively that if anyone discovered their situation, they might be separated and placed in different foster homes. She had become their protector, their provider, and their only source of stability in a world that had abandoned them. Her brothers had adapted to their isolation in heartbreaking ways. The 14-year-old had stopped asking when their mother would come home. The 11-year-old had created an entire fantasy world to cope with the reality of their situation. Both boys had essentially become prisoners in their own home, afraid to venture outside because their sister had convinced them it wasn't safe. But what about their mother? Keisha Williams wasn't missing or dead. She wasn't incapacitated by mental illness or addiction, though those factors may have played a role in her decisions. She was living her life, forming relationships, and pursuing her own happiness while her children struggled to survive without her. Court documents would later reveal that Williams had moved in with a series of boyfriends over the 3-year period, traveling between Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio while essentially treating her children like a burden she could simply abandon. She would occasionally send money through cash apps, just enough to keep them alive, but never enough to truly care for them. This wasn't neglect born of desperation or circumstances beyond her control. This was a calculated decision to prioritize her romantic relationships over her responsibilities as a mother. The psychological profile of a woman who could abandon her children for years while living freely with romantic partners reveals disturbing patterns that experts say are more common than most people realize. Dr. Angela Foster, a child psychologist who has studied abandonment cases involving African American families, explains that parents who commit this level of neglect often have histories of their own childhood trauma, but they also display narcissistic tendencies that allow them to compartmentalize their responsibilities. What makes Williams' case particularly shocking is the duration and the deliberate nature of the abandonment. This wasn't a mother who left for a weekend and never came back. This was a systematic abandonment that lasted for years, maintained through occasional money transfers that served more to ease her own guilt than to actually care for her children. Now, I want you to pause and think about this timeline. 3 years. That means these children went through holidays, birthdays, the height of the pandemic, school closures, and countless daily challenges completely on their own. How do you think they managed to stay hidden from teachers, social workers, and other adults who might have noticed their situation? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I'm curious about your theories on how they stayed off the radar for so long. The answer lies in a combination of their older sister's intelligence and the tragic gaps in our social safety systems. When schools closed for remote learning during the pandemic, the children simply stopped participating. No one followed up consistently enough to discover their situation. The girl had learned to forge her mother's signature and handle basic interactions with delivery drivers and utility workers when necessary. They survived on a rotation of pizza deliveries, fast food, and whatever non-perishable items they could have delivered to their apartment. The older girl had figured out online grocery delivery and had become an expert at making small amounts of money stretch for days or weeks. But this wasn't sustainable living, this was barely surviving. The physical conditions inside the apartment deteriorated over time in ways that investigators described as almost unimaginable. Without proper sanitation, garbage management, or basic household maintenance, the apartment had become what Lake County Sheriff Raymond Johnson called uninhabitable. The children had adapted to these conditions because they had no choice, but the impact on their physical and mental health was severe. The boys showed signs of prolonged isolation that concerned medical professionals who examined them after their rescue. They had difficulty making eye contact with adults, spoke in whispers, and displayed symptoms consistent with long-term trauma. The girl, despite her role as protector, was severely underweight and showed signs of chronic stress that had likely been building for years. But here's what's truly remarkable about these children: they never gave up on each other. Despite the impossible circumstances, despite having every reason to despair, they created a family unit that kept them alive. The girl never abandoned her brothers, even when caring for them meant sacrificing her own childhood completely. The boys supported each other and trusted their sister's judgment even when they didn't understand why they couldn't leave the apartment. This brings us to the question that haunts everyone who learns about this case: how did no one notice? In an age of social media, school attendance tracking, and mandatory reporting, how did 3 children disappear from society for 3 years without anyone raising an alarm? The answer reveals uncomfortable truths about how easy it is for vulnerable children to slip through the cracks, especially when they're actively trying to avoid detection. The family had moved frequently before settling in the Gary apartment, which meant they had no deep community connections. The children weren't enrolled in local schools consistently, and their mother had trained them to avoid drawing attention to themselves. During the pandemic, when many families struggled with remote learning and social isolation, their situation didn't seem unusual to the few adults who might have noticed. Delivery drivers saw a teenager answering the door, which didn't raise immediate red flags. Building maintenance staff had minimal contact with the family, and when they did interact, it was usually with the older girl who had learned to present herself as mature and responsible. What finally led to their discovery wasn't a concerned teacher or alert neighbor, it was economics. The property manager came to inspect the apartment because rent payments had become irregular and neighbors had complained about strange odors coming from the unit. When she entered the apartment that August day, she immediately knew something was terribly wrong. Sheriff Johnson described the scene as one of the worst cases of neglect his department had ever encountered. The smell hit investigators before they fully entered the apartment. Garbage was piled so high in some rooms that it reached the ceiling. The children had been using makeshift bathroom facilities because the plumbing had failed. There was no functioning kitchen, no clean clothing, and no space that could reasonably be called livable. But what struck responders most wasn't just the physical conditions, it was the children's reaction to being discovered. They weren't relieved or grateful for rescue. They were terrified. They begged not to be separated. The girl tried to convince investigators that their mother would be back soon, that she had just stepped out temporarily. The boys clung to their sister and refused to speak to strangers. This reaction tells us everything we need to know about how these children had learned to survive. They had created their own version of normal, and from their perspective, the outside world represented the greatest threat to their family unit. They had no concept of what healthy family relationships looked like because they had been forced to create their own family structure based on survival rather than love and support. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Williams' abandonment. Cell phone records showed she had been living with various boyfriends across Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio. Financial records indicated she had access to government assistance and employment income, but had chosen to spend that money on her own needs rather than properly caring for her children. Text messages recovered from her phone showed she was aware of her children's situation but viewed them as an obstacle to her romantic relationships. In one message to a friend, she complained about having to send money for their food again, as if feeding her children was an unreasonable burden rather than a basic parental responsibility. Perhaps most disturbing were messages where she discussed her children with potential romantic partners. She consistently presented herself as having limited custody or responsibilities, essentially lying about her role as their primary parent. She had created an entirely false identity that allowed her to pursue relationships without the inconvenience of her children. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court revealed a woman who displayed classic signs of narcissistic personality disorder combined with what experts called maternal detachment syndrome. She showed little genuine remorse for her actions and continued to justify her behavior by claiming her children were better off without her constant presence. This kind of rationalization is common among parents who commit severe neglect, according to Dr. Jerome Washington, a forensic psychologist who has evaluated hundreds of child abuse cases. These parents often convince themselves that their children are more resilient than they actually are, or that their absence is somehow beneficial rather than harmful. Williams' own childhood history revealed patterns of instability and abandonment that may have contributed to her inability to form healthy attachments with her own children. However, experts emphasize that childhood trauma, while it may explain certain behaviors, never excuses the decision to abandon children or subject them to years of neglect. What do you think drives a mother to make these choices? Is it purely selfishness, mental illness, or something more complex? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, especially from those of you who work in child welfare or psychology. The legal proceedings moved quickly once the children were discovered. Williams was arrested and charged with multiple counts of child abuse, neglect, and abandonment. The charges carried potential sentences ranging from several years to life in prison, depending on how prosecutors decided to pursue the case. But the legal system was only one part of the response to this tragedy. The Gary community rallied around these children in ways that restored faith in human compassion. Within days of the story breaking, donations poured in from across the Midwest. Local churches offered services, families volunteered to help, and child welfare organizations worked around the clock to ensure the children received proper medical care and psychological support. The children were initially placed in emergency foster care, but efforts were immediately begun to keep them together. Child welfare workers recognized that their bond was the one healthy relationship they had maintained throughout their ordeal, and separating them would cause additional trauma. Medical evaluations revealed the full extent of the neglect's impact. All three children were significantly underweight and showed signs of chronic malnutrition. They had dental problems that had gone untreated for years, and their vision had been affected by the dim conditions in their apartment. The boys showed symptoms of agoraphobia and severe social anxiety that would require long-term therapy. But there were also signs of remarkable resilience. Despite their physical condition, all three children were intellectually capable and emotionally connected to each other. The girl had essentially educated herself through online resources and had maintained surprising emotional stability given her circumstances. The boys, while traumatized, showed signs of trust and affection that indicated their capacity for healthy relationships had not been completely destroyed. The road to recovery would be long and complex. Therapists specializing in childhood trauma began working with the children immediately, focusing first on helping them understand that they were safe and that their basic needs would be met consistently. The boys needed intensive therapy to address their isolation and fear of the outside world. The girl needed help processing her role as caregiver and learning how to be a teenager again rather than a parent figure. Educational assessments showed that while the children had fallen behind academically, they were capable of catching up with proper support. The older girl was particularly motivated to continue her education, seeing it as a path to independence and the ability to continue caring for her brothers if needed. Social workers also had to address the complex family dynamics that had developed during their years of isolation. The boys had become completely dependent on their sister, while she had taken on responsibilities that no teenager should carry. Learning to form relationships with adult caregivers and authority figures would be a crucial part of their healing process. The community response continued to evolve as more details about the case emerged. Local schools offered specialized programs to help the children reintegrate into educational settings. Healthcare providers donated services to address their medical and dental needs. Mental health professionals volunteered their time to ensure the children received trauma-informed therapy. But perhaps most importantly, several families stepped forward expressing interest in adopting all three children together. This wasn't just about providing them with homes, it was about preserving the family bond that had kept them alive during their darkest years. Williams' trial became a focal point for discussions about child welfare systems and the warning signs that adults should watch for in their communities. Prosecutors used the case to highlight gaps in mandatory reporting and tracking systems that allow vulnerable children to disappear from official oversight. The defense attempted to argue that Williams' own traumatic childhood and mental health issues should be considered mitigating factors in her sentencing. However, the prosecution presented evidence showing that she had access to mental health resources and government assistance programs that could have helped her address her problems without abandoning her children. Expert witnesses testified about the long-term impact of abandonment and neglect on child development. They explained how the trauma these children experienced would affect them for years to come, requiring ongoing therapy and support to overcome. The financial cost of their recovery, estimated in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, was presented as evidence of the broader social impact of Williams' actions. In February 2024, Keisha Williams was sentenced to 20 years in prison on charges of child abuse and abandonment. The judge noted that while her own troubled background was a factor in her actions, the deliberate and sustained nature of her abandonment warranted significant punishment. She would be eligible for parole after serving 12 years, at which point her children would be adults. The children, now placed with a loving foster family committed to adopting all three, are beginning to build new lives. The girl has enrolled in high school and is working with tutors to catch up academically. The boys are slowly adjusting to life outside their former prison, attending therapy sessions and learning to trust again. Their recovery represents hope not just for these specific children, but for our understanding of resilience and the power of human connection. Despite experiencing abandonment that would break many adults, they maintained their love for each other and their will to survive. This case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how we monitor child welfare in our communities. How many other children might be struggling in isolation right now? What signs should we watch for? How can we create systems that truly protect vulnerable children rather than just processing paperwork? The Gary case also highlights the importance of community response when tragedies are discovered. The outpouring of support for these children showed that when people understand the depth of need, they will step up to help. But we shouldn't wait for extreme cases like this to pay attention to the children in our communities who might need assistance. As we conclude this story, I want you to think about the children in your own neighborhood. Are there kids you haven't seen playing outside recently? Families that seem isolated or struggling? Sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply pay attention and be willing to ask questions when something doesn't seem right. These three children survived because they refused to give up on each other. Their sister's determination to protect her brothers, and their trust in her, created a family bond strong enough to overcome unimaginable circumstances. But they shouldn't have had to survive on their own. Every child deserves adults who will notice when they're in trouble and step in to help. What warning signs do you think people in this community should have recognized? How can we do better at protecting vulnerable children? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this story has affected you, consider supporting local child welfare organizations in your area. The Williams children's story is still being written. They're learning to trust adults again, discovering what healthy families look like, and slowly healing from years of trauma. Their resilience reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit can endure and hope can survive. Thank you for joining me for this difficult but important story. If cases like this motivate you to stay informed about child welfare issues, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Together, we can work to ensure that no child has to face abandonment alone. Remember, if you suspect a child in your community is being neglected or abused, don't hesitate to contact local authorities or child protective services. Your call could save a life.